and bonjour à tous. I'm delighted to be here and speak about our companion to philanthropy. Ours is quite different from what you heard from Professor Handy, because what we tried to do in this volume that has some 40 authors from 13 countries is to imagine philanthropy as a continuum, from thinking about the impetus to engaging in philanthropy, to the institutional factors that support philanthropy, the foundations, the community practices, all that kind of middle piece, to the impact of philanthropy. So from impetus to impact, and along the way trying to identify what are some of the big trends, what are the things to watch for, and where might that take us. I acknowledge greatly my co-editors, Tobias Young, who is at St. Andrews in Scotland, and Jenny Harrow, who is at the Cass Business School at City University, London. And I will apologize, first of all, for having to give my speech in English, but secondly, for the price of the book. Same reason, don't buy it, get your library to buy it, and don't tell the publisher I said that. The book intentionally has a picture of rocky shores on it, because we think there are potentially some rocky shores ahead for philanthropy. Also some bright spots, but some things to watch for, some shoals, some turbulence, things to pay attention to. We too take a very broad definition of philanthropy as the use of private resources, time, treasure, and talent for public purposes. But again, we're primarily focused on giving just because of the magnitude of the topic. And we see some big disruptions ahead, and what I will do is talk about some of those things to watch for. Why look at international trends? We're working in a particular place. Why pay attention to what's happening internationally? Well, I would suggest that sometimes those little whispers, those little whiffs of things changing somewhere else, pretty soon end up as seemingly hurricane force in our own work. So paying attention to things that are just starting to change elsewhere can have an impact on where we are in our own work. And the consequences of not paying attention can be quite significant. So what are some of the overall patterns of philanthropy in developing countries? It's quite different looking across the world, and we haven't taken the kind of systematic view that Professor Handy and her team has done. But there's a bit of a puzzle here in what's happening, and things we need to pay attention to. In Canada, the UK, Australia, if you look at the overall aggregate level of giving, it stayed pretty much the same. A little bit of variation, but more or less the same in terms of amounts. However, if you look underneath that, there are a whole variety of things going on. The average level of household giving has remained stagnant for decades. And we know that those who are at lower income levels are actually more generous in the sense that they give a higher proportion of their household income than do wealthy individuals. That average level has stayed more or less the same in those countries, however, because of some very big gifts by high net worth individuals. On the other hand, we also know that high net worth individuals are not stepping up as much as they might be. Again, enormous variation of some very large gifts and many high net worth individuals not giving to their capacity, which suggests that we need to expand the base, both grow out the participation across the population of those who could give, and enhance those who can give more to encourage them to do so. Again, doesn't apply to every country, but and Kathy Barr can speak more to this, but it seems to be a trend among the developing countries. So I want to talk about some specific trends, changes in demographics to start with. And I'll talk about women, minority communities, the millennials, briefly the decline in religious affiliation, the rise of the global south, and the intergenerational transfer of wealth that is predicted. First, women. Women are becoming a much more important factor in civil society globally. They are emerging as leaders, and in philanthropy in many, many countries. They're much better able to make gifts in their own right, as well as participate in household decision-making. But what's interesting is how they approach their philanthropy is somewhat different from their male colleagues. They are much more likely to do due diligence. They find out about the organizations that they're thinking about giving. They may volunteer with them. They may participate in a variety of ways. So they get to know and become committed to the particular causes that they're giving to, and they may give in different ways to different kinds of causes, more likely to support advocacy and more likely to support international causes. Again, those are based on only a few studies, but they seem to be pointing in that direction. Whereas men still, particularly high net worth men, tend to give because they're asked. Their buddy asks them, or colleague asks them to give, so they do, knowing that they will ask that colleague somewhere down the road. So women are an emerging larger force. They give differently, and therefore fundraising to women needs to happen in different ways. The millennials, those born between 1980 and 2000, are the largest, most diverse cohort in history. They are already 35% of the workforce and will soon, by 2025, not that far away, be 75% of the workforce. We tend to think of them as, watching video games on mom and dad's sofa in the basement. Right? But that's not true. Millennials are, in fact, the most engaged cohort in history. They volunteer at greater rates than their parents, and they give at very high rates. Now, they're not yet giving much because they don't yet have high incomes, but the rate at which they are giving is in significant amounts. And they don't exercise the kind of organizational loyalty that their parents might have. They're not saying, I always gave to the Cancer Society or the Red Cross, so that's what I will do. They too do due diligence. They mix their activism with their giving. They're much more likely to be spontaneous using online technologies. But you need to ask them. This is the generation that spent its time in daycare, and they're fairly good at following rules and doing what's expected, but you have to ask them. It's not going to happen necessarily spontaneously. And they value authenticity in the sense of they value what's meaningful, and they have great antenna for spotting what is meaningful. I'll briefly touch on some of the others. Minority communities, we know very little about how minority communities give, and our stereotype is that they're quite insulated. The few studies we have, again from Canada and the US, suggest that minority communities actually give at higher than average rates, not only within their own cultural communities, but on, I'll call them mainstream causes, to things that affect the population in general. But they are, to a large extent, an untapped source, and both of giving and of engagement in boards in a whole range of our organizations. The rise of the global south is important to keep in mind. We built many of our understandings and practices around philanthropy as if they were only domestic, but the rise of the middle class in the global south means you'll have new kinds of interregional patterns, and the rise of the billionaires, particularly coming out of Asia, many of whom are connected to diaspora communities, and we pointed to Famina Handy's own work on the diaspora community in India in the book, to give you an example of that. and this intergenerational transfer of wealth that is expected to, will happen over the next few decades. The question remains how much of that will go into charitable and philanthropic causes. Big question. And I would put to you that what really matters there are the role of philanthropic advisors. Wealth managers, your lawyers, your accountants, your estate planners, all of that group who advise on giving and planning for philanthropic activity. And the few studies, then a good one in Canada, shows that what those advisors, the kind of advice and amount of advice they say they're giving their clients and what their clients say they're getting is very far apart, in that the clients aren't getting the kinds of direction that they need and want from their advisors. So sitting in a nonprofit organization, and in the sector as a whole, I would be trying very hard to tap into what's happening and the knowledge base and the training of some of those advisors. I think we're in a world of changing expectations that will have profound effect on philanthropy. The collaborative economy, the Ubers, the Airbnbs, all of that is affecting how we think about trust. Trust still exists, it's just much more dependent on transparency. And I think transparency is something we absolutely need to watch for in this sector. What's the implication of transparency? It puts data at the center, and we have expectations of immediate feedback. It's like, it wouldn't be hard to create, and I understand it's already happening, the TripAdvisor for nonprofits or philanthropic foundations. What was my experience? Suddenly it's on the web and you only got a 3.5. It's going to mean, I would suggest, a much greater attention to reporting and to good governance, how your organizations are governed. We see regulators starting to pay more attention to that, but I think we'll see the public pay much more attention to that. It enhances the benefit of accreditation as a good housekeeping seal and as a real indication that there's been some quality control. And Kathy may speak to you about the great work that Imagine Canada is doing with the standards program. And it reinforces the interest in impact. Surveys show that while there's still trust, and this is Canadian data, trust in the sector is still quite healthy, but people increasingly want to know, where does the money go and what impact did you have with it? Transparency will mean that reputation really matters, and those expectations of reporting and public accountability about what we've achieved. Not just that we intend to do good, but that we are achieving good things will really matter. Impact. This means there's much greater attention to impact. What difference do we make and how do we show it? And whether it's foundations or nonprofits, charities that are not paying attention to telling their story well with a focus on impact will be at a disadvantage. I think one of those little whispers that's happening internationally that we need to pay attention to is the debate over income inequality, which is certainly more pronounced in the US than it is here, but it's still significant. And that's playing out around a whole variety of new questions about private wealth and the use of private wealth and public benefit. And it's happening in the US in terms of all kinds of critical questions around the role of foundations, around where does the money go and how does it benefit society. And I think philanthropy needs to be positioned to answer some of those questions in a way that it hasn't been before, because the questions have not been so direct and so pointed. We address in the book the big change around social investment and social impact, which is the use of private investment for public good that has an expectation of both a social return and a financial return. So these are the impact investments. They take the forms of social impact bonds, all of that impact investing market, which has become huge on a global scale. And there are several implications coming out of that. One is that we're almost at the stage where there is more private capital available for investment than there are organizations and projects ready to use it. And that depends on the conception of risk of those organizations, their financial literacy, the ability of intermediaries to bring pools of money together to get it out in the sector. It will have, I think, a profound effect. And we're already seeing some of those. Recognize these guys? Mark Zuckerberg, Ms. Priscilla Chan made the huge gift of, quote, gift of their money from Facebook. But they didn't give it away as a philanthropic gift. They put it in a vehicle that they can control. They will be able to control for many years where it goes, how it's invested, and how it's used. And that's very typical of those sort of 40-ish entrepreneurs who made money early, particularly in high tech, although not confined to high tech, who are interested in global impact, they're interested in things international, and they're very strategic, and they want to control how they use their philanthropy. And they're sector agnostic. Rather than saying we're going to give our money to registered charities, we're going to think about a whole variety of other vehicles which we might use for our investing. Some of which could be social purpose businesses. So the competition, the other players in the sector has become much more diverse and much more interesting, but much more challenging how to play as a regular nonprofit in that area. The corporate sector, we have a chapter on corporate philanthropy, which has morphed significantly from thinking about sponsorships and just corporate giving into strategic alliances of what's good for the business and shared value of being able to achieve a social benefit while aligning with the corporate's key business line, and the organizations that can find, the nonprofits that can find their own alignment there. I would suggest that we'll see a bifurcation, a diversity in the sector of those nonprofits and charities that are willing to engage, that can see that strategic alliance, and those that are not interested, remain highly skeptical, often for good reasons, but that are not prepared to engage or can't find the right kind of partnerships with the corporate sector. And it sometimes means that as a nonprofit, we need to ask for different things. We need to ask for talent from our corporate partners, rather than just asking for sponsorship or funding. Foundations. We spend several chapters in the companion looking at foundations, and some new debates are happening. One is, and you're probably already feeling this, the debate over perpetuity. Why do you put money in forever and ever and ever, perpetuity, versus funding up front and using money now to solve current problems? That debate has been around for several years, but it's growing. Foundations are increasingly pressed to be transparent, and many, particularly family foundations, have not seen the need to do so. And we're seeing the question of, are there too many small foundations that are so small that they can't have impact? And again, that's tied to the debate about income inequality. Those small foundations, if you're not having an impact, maybe are just a place for parking private wealth. And again, it's tied into that private wealth inequality debate. And we're seeing the same kind of debate around donor-advised funds, whether they're held by financial institutions or community foundations. The question of, do they spend out at the rate that they are required to do so and that is acceptable, or are they simply parking lots for private wealth, for charity, specialized? We're seeing we're seeing this in many places, a whole variety of informal forms of community philanthropy, of giving circles, of much more informal ways of coming together. And they become more specialized by place. They're engaged in the places where they live, the Giving While You Live movement. They really depend on peer-to-peer learning. And that's part of the joy of those giving circles. How do you learn more about philanthropy from your peers? And anything as a sector we can do to enhance that, I think, has positive benefit. We're seeing an increased expectation of the role of community and other place-based foundations, like family foundations, take up leadership roles in their communities. And we're starting to see some interesting developments from the support of governments, particularly local governments, with community benefit agreements that require big infrastructure projects to have a community positive benefit. We don't talk in the book about service integration, but I think we need to think about the reform of services as part of this. And I'll just very quickly say that I think that goes to part of the discussion around, are there too many charities? A refrain we hear regularly. And it's the push by many governments, although the debate has been around for decades, around how do we have more integrated services, might be more multi-sectoral, and how do we encourage greater collaboration for greater impact in a contracting environment that has always rewarded competition. The way you gain reputation in that competitive environment is to build your own brand as opposed to collaborating. And I think we're increasingly seeing the need to change the incentives for more collaboration. I think it's going to be an interesting question of what happens when that debate over income inequality and the sharing economy and Donald Trump collide. And I put Trump in there in part because the New York Attorney General is currently investigating the work of his foundation, and as well as what he might do in the presidency. But as those media reports have international influence, again, I think all of those influence transparency, the value of data, and the need to demonstrate impact. In the interest of time, I will briefly touch around public policy and what we might see coming out of some of the policy debates, again with that international wind blowing. We're starting to see in some places a debate over tax incentives. Are they too generous? That hasn't happened in Canada yet. It is happening in the US. Political activities, whether you look at Australia or New Zealand or the UK, the debate about the political activities that foundations and charities can do is in question. The issue of cross-border giving, given the internationalization of philanthropy, we set up our policy tax regimes assuming that you only gave in the country in which you live. But how do we accommodate cross-border giving? Do we want to promote it or do we want to restrict it? Will be on the policy agenda. Does reporting that is tied to tax status for charities require reporting on your public benefit? That's an innovation coming out of the UK, where charities need to annually report on how they demonstrate that they've had a public benefit, and it's starting to be talked about in other places. We'll see more interest around transparency of nonprofits that are not registered charities, all of the professional trade associations, etc. And again, I think we'll see an interesting new role for provincial and local governments, not in regulating or policy, but engaging with the sector in new ways. So quickly to sum up, what are the implications for the philanthropic and nonprofit sector? I think we're at a stage we need to rethink how we refrain from competition to collaboration, to make a much greater case for our assets and our strengths, particularly as we work with governments and the corporate sector, to think about some of those strategic alignments. This will require a whole variety of new leadership skills, and we can perhaps talk about that in our second session. We're in an age of disruptive technologies, and we need to use those technologies, need to better engage with data analytics, which can be our friend if we know how to use them well and are not afraid of them. And we need to get out in front of the impact movement, because that, I think, is going to be the greatest internationally and locally felt imperative for this sector. Thank you.